Sometimes the coldest winter can melt the hardest heart. Sometimes redemption comes knocking when you least expect it. In 1887, Silas Monroe lives alone on his ranch, hiding from a past filled with greed and cruelty. The wealthy landowner built his fortune destroying families in his pursuit of power. Now, at 63, he lives as a recluse, haunted by his choices. But when two desperate black children appear at his door during a blizzard, everything changes. Their mother has vanished in the storm, and they have nowhere to turn. Silas faces a choice between the bitter man he's become and the person he might be. Can a lifetime of hatred truly be undone by an act of mercy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather portfolio sat on Silas Monroe's desk like a monument to greed. Each deed inside represented a family displaced, a dream crushed, a life forever altered by his relentless pursuit of land. 43 properties in all, acquired through methods that would make a decent man sick to his stomach. Silas stared at the collection through the frost-covered window of his study, watching snow pile against the glass in the pre-dawn darkness of December 1887. The blizzard had been building for 2 days, transforming his sprawling ranch into an island of isolation. Perfect, he thought. The world could disappear entirely, and he wouldn't miss a soul. 15 years ago, he had been a different man. Silas Monroe, land baron of the Montana Territory, owner of the largest cattle operation between Billings and the Canadian border. He had worn fine suits, dined with politicians, and commanded respect through fear rather than honor. His name appeared in newspapers across 3 states, usually followed by words like ruthless and unstoppable. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began in 1871, when the railroad companies started pushing west, bringing promises of prosperity and progress. Silas saw opportunity where others saw change. He began buying up properties along the proposed rail lines, often using tactics that bordered on extortion. When persuasion failed, he employed less diplomatic methods. There was old Henrik Anderson, the Norwegian farmer who refused to sell his 100 acres despite mounting debts. Silas had arranged for Henrik's credit to be cut off at every bank within 50 miles. When Henrik's crops failed that autumn, Silas was there with cash in hand and a contract that left the man with nothing but a wagon and bitter tears. The widow Morrison had been even easier. After her husband died in a mining accident, Silas simply waited. Winter came early that year, and by February she was desperate enough to accept his offer of 1/10 of what the land was worth. He remembered her standing in his office, clutching her infant son, signing papers she couldn't read while tears froze on her cheeks, property after property, family after family. The deeds accumulated like trophies, each one a testament to his ability to identify weakness and exploit it without mercy. By 1875, Silas owned more land than some European princes. The railroad companies paid him handsomely for his foresight, and politicians courted his influence with careful words and nervous smiles. But success came with a price that took years to collect. Sarah Monroe had been the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, a woman of gentle spirit and unwavering faith. She married Silas when he was still building his empire, drawn to his ambition and confident that love could temper his harder edges. For a time, it seemed she might be right. Their daughter Emma arrived in 1876, a golden-haired angel who filled their home with laughter and reminded Silas that some things mattered more than money. Sarah tried to soften his methods, suggesting charity work and community involvement. She organized church socials and invited the families of his displaced victims to dinner, hoping to build bridges that Silas had burned. But business was business, and Silas kept his 2 worlds carefully separate. During the day, he foreclosed on farms and manipulated land prices. In the evening, he read bedtime stories to Emma and listened to Sarah play piano in their parlor. The fever came in the spring of 1882. Influenza swept through the territory like wildfire, claiming victims regardless of age or social station. Emma fell ill first, her bright spirit dimming as her small body fought a battle it couldn't win. Sarah followed within days, weakened by grief and her refusal to leave their daughter's bedside. Silas buried them together under a simple wooden cross on the hill behind their house. The cross still stood there, weathered by 5 winters and carved with words that now seemed to mock him. Beloved wife and daughter, together in God's grace. He had written those words in a fog of grief, still believing that faith might offer some comfort. Time had taught him otherwise. The business empire crumbled after their deaths. Silas lost all interest in acquisition and manipulation. He released most of his ranch hands, sold his cattle, and retreated into solitude. The politicians stopped calling. The newspapers found other names to print. The land deeds gathered dust, while Silas learned the true weight of silence. 5 years of isolation had changed him from a feared businessman into a ghost of his former self. His hair had turned completely grey, and deep lines mapped the geography of his regret across his weathered face. He rose each morning at dawn, tended to his remaining livestock, and spent his evenings reading books that Sarah had loved. The routine kept him alive, but offered no joy. The town of Cedar Falls lay 7 miles south of his ranch, close enough to ride for supplies, but distant enough to avoid unwanted company. Most residents gave him a wide berth when he appeared for monthly provisions. They remembered the families he had displaced, the dreams he had destroyed. Their children crossed streets to avoid him, and their wives whispered prayers of protection when he passed. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very people he had wronged through his pursuit of isolation now granted him exactly what he claimed to want. They feared him still, but the fear had transformed from respect into revulsion. He was a cautionary tale, a reminder of what greed could do to a man's soul. Among the displaced families were the railroad workers who had come seeking opportunity and found only hardship. The tracks that Silas had helped route through the territory brought trainloads of dreamers looking for steady work and new beginnings. Most were European immigrants, but a significant number were freed slaves from the South, following rumors of fair wages and equal treatment. The reality proved harsher than the promises. Railroad work was dangerous and poorly paid, especially for black families who faced additional barriers and restrictions. They lived in company camps with inadequate shelter and insufficient food, sending most of their wages back to relatives, still struggling in the South. When winter came, many found themselves stranded between construction sites, too poor to travel and too proud to beg. Among these families was a woman named Ruth Washington, a former slave from Alabama who had worked her way north through a network of railroad jobs and domestic work. She was known for her intelligence and her willingness to help other families navigate the complex world of railroad employment. Ruth had 2 children, a daughter and son she was raising alone after her husband died in a construction accident. Near Butte, Ruth's reputation extended beyond the railroad camps. She could read and write, skills that made her valuable to both workers and management. She helped illiterate men understand their contracts and assisted families with everything, from medical care to basic education. Her small frame contained a fierce determination to build a better life for her children and anyone else she could help along the way. But even Ruth Washington's determination couldn't control the weather. The blizzard that began on December 15th was unlike anything the territory had seen in decades. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero, and wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour. Railroad operations shut down completely, leaving hundreds of workers stranded without pay or adequate shelter. Silas knew none of these details as he sat in his study, watching snow accumulate against his windows. He had long ago stopped paying attention to the struggles of others, focusing instead on managing his own guilt and regret. The land deeds in their leather portfolio represented the only connection he maintained to his former life, a reminder of the man he had been and the price he had paid for becoming him. The wind howled around his house, rattling windows and doors. With increasing intensity, somewhere in that storm, people were fighting for survival. Somewhere in that storm, decisions were being made that would change lives forever. But Silas Monroe, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the silence of his present, remained unaware that redemption was already walking through the snow toward his door. The knocking came just after sunset, so faint that Silas almost missed it beneath the howling wind. He paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips, wondering if his imagination had conjured the sound. The storm had been raging for hours, building to a fury that made travel impossible for man or beast. The knocking came again, more urgent this time. 3 sharp raps against his front door, followed by a pause, then 3 more. Silas set down his cup and moved to the window, brushing frost. From the glass to peer into the swirling darkness. The wind drove snow horizontally across his porch, making visibility nearly impossible. Probably the wind, he muttered, but something in the rhythm of the sound suggested human desperation rather than natural chaos. He hadn't had a visitor in over a year, and nobody in their right mind would venture out in this weather. The knocking resumed, weaker now, but persistent. Silas grabbed a lantern from the kitchen table and made his way to the front door, his boots echoing in the empty hallway. He hesitated with his hand on the bolt, considering the wisdom of opening his door to whatever waited in the storm. "Please, sir." The voice was barely audible above the wind, high and frightened. "Please, we need help." Silas's blood chilled at the word "we." Multiple people meant multiple problems, multiple complications he wasn't prepared to handle. He had spent 5 years avoiding human contact, and now humanity was literally knocking on his door in the middle of the worst blizzard he'd ever seen. "Go away," he called through the door. "Find shelter in town." "We can't make it to town, sir. Please, we're children." Children. The word hit him like a physical blow, awakening memories he'd worked years to bury. Emma's voice echoing through these. Same halls, her laughter bouncing off these same walls. He closed his eyes and tried to push the images away. But the knocking continued, weaker now, accompanied by what sounded like crying. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn away, Silas lifted the bolt and opened the door. 2 figures stood huddled on his porch, so covered in snow they looked like small ghosts. The larger figure, a boy perhaps 10 years old, had his arms wrapped around a smaller child, a girl who couldn't be more than 8. Both were black, their dark skin a stark contrast to the white snow that clung to their ragged clothes. Their lips were blue with cold, and their eyes held the hollow desperation of people who had reached the end of their endurance. "Sir," the boy said through chattering teeth, "we need food and shelter. Please, sir, my sister, she can't walk no more." The words cut through Silas like a blade, not because of their desperation, but because of their formality. Even in their extremity, these children addressed him with respect he didn't deserve. The boy's grammar suggested limited education, but his manner spoke of careful upbringing and ingrained politeness. Silas stared at them for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications of what they were asking. 2 black children, alone in a blizzard, seeking shelter from a white man with a reputation for cruelty. The situation was fraught with danger for all of them, loaded with the kind of racial tensions that could destroy lives even in the best of circumstances. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice harsher than he intended. "Our mama." The girl spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. "She went to find work at the rail camp 3 days ago. She told us to wait, but the storm came, and she didn't come back." "The camp's 20 miles from here," Silas said. "How did you find my ranch?" "We've been walking since yesterday," the boy replied. "Mama told us if we ever got lost, follow the fence lines. They'll lead to people. We saw your light." The girl's legs gave out, and she sagged against her brother. The boy, despite his own exhaustion, held her upright with a determination that reminded Silas painfully of his own protective instincts toward Emma. The sight of that small act of courage, a child caring for someone even smaller and more vulnerable, cracked something inside his chest. "She's sick," the boy continued. "Please, sir, we won't be no trouble. We just need somewhere warm." Silas looked past them into the storm. The wind was picking up, driving snow with such force that it stung his face. Even in the shelter of the porch, the temperature had to be well below zero, and it was still dropping. These children wouldn't survive another hour in the open, but letting them in meant responsibility. It meant caring for people again, something he'd sworn never to do. It meant opening his heart to the possibility of loss, of pain, of all the emotions he'd spent 5 years learning to suppress. He began, then stopped. The girl's eyes were rolling back in her head, and her brother was struggling to keep her upright. Whatever internal debate he was having, it was luxury these children couldn't afford. "Get inside," he said roughly, stepping back to give them room. "Quickly, before we all freeze." They stumbled through the doorway, bringing with them the smell of snow and fear, and something else, something sweet and desperate that Silas recognized as hope. The boy helped his sister to a chair near the fireplace while Silas bolted the door against the storm. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, his voice thick with relief. "Thank you so much," Silas said nothing. He busied himself stoking the fire, adding logs until the flames roared high enough to push warmth into the corners of the room. Behind him, he could hear the children's breathing slowly steadying as the heat began to thaw their frozen bodies. "What are your names?" he asked without turning around. "I'm Samuel," the boy replied. "This is my sister Mary. What's your name, sir?" "Monroe," Silas said curtly. He didn't offer his first name, didn't want to encourage familiarity. Mary began to cry softly, a sound that cut through Silas like a rusty knife. He turned to see her fumbling with something at her throat, a small brass locket that had somehow survived their ordeal. Inside, he glimpsed the tiny photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "Is that your mother?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. Mary nodded, clutching the locket like a lifeline. "Mama Ruth. She said this would keep us safe, keep us together, but she's lost in the storm and we don't know how to find her." "Ruth," Silas frowned. The name was familiar, though he couldn't place it immediately. "Ruth Washington," Samuel supplied. "She works for the railroad, helps other folks with their reading and such. You know her?" Silas shook his head, though something tugged at his memory. He'd heard the name mentioned in town, always with respect. A woman who helped others, who made things better, instead of worse. The opposite of everything he'd been. "We should eat something," he said, more to fill the silence than from any desire to play host. "Are you hungry?" Both children nodded eagerly, and Silas realized they probably hadn't eaten in days. He moved to the kitchen, rummaging through his meager supplies for something appropriate for children. He found some bread, a bit of preserved meat, and milk that hadn't yet frozen. As he prepared the simple meal, he became aware of the children's voices behind him. Samuel whispering reassurances to his sister, Mary quietly praying for their mother's safety. Their words were filled with love and faith, qualities that felt foreign in a house that had known only grief and silence for so long. Outside, the storm intensified. The wind screamed around the house with increasing fury, rattling windows and shaking the walls. Snow piled against the doors and windows, sealing them inside together, whether they liked it or not. Silas set the food before them and watched as they ate with careful politeness, using their fingers to break the bread into small pieces and sharing everything equally. Even in their desperation, they maintained dignity and consideration for each other. "The storm's getting worse," Samuel observed, glancing toward the windows. "We might be here for a while." "Yes," Silas replied, the reality of the situation settling over him like a weight. "You might, As if to emphasize the point, a tremendous gust of wind slammed against the house, making the timbers groan and the fire flicker. They were trapped. Together now, this unlikely trio. A bitter old man haunted by his past and two children searching for hope in the storm. Silas stood in the doorway of what had once been Emma's room, holding a lantern that cast dancing shadows across dust-covered furniture. The bed was too small for both children, but it was the only spare room in the house. His own bedroom held too many ghosts, and the parlor was too cold for sleeping. "You can stay here tonight," he said, his voice gruff with discomfort. "I'll find some blankets." Samuel and Mary peered past him into the room, their eyes wide with wonder. After days in the cold, any shelter would have seemed luxurious, but Emma's room still held traces of childhood joy that made it feel magical. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its painted mane faded but still cheerful. Books lined a small shelf, their spines worn smooth by loving hands. "This was your little girl's room," Mary whispered, not asking but understanding with the intuition that children possess. Silas's throat tightened. "Yes. Where is she now?" Samuel asked with the directness of youth. "She died." The words came out harder than Silas intended, cutting off any further questions. He turned away before he could see the sympathy in their young faces. In the linen closet, he found blankets that smelled of lavender and memories. Sarah had made them herself, spending winter evenings by the fire with her needlework while Emma played at her feet. His hands trembled as he pulled them from the shelf, wondering how two small children could stir up emotions he'd thought permanently buried. When he returned to the room, he found the children examining one of Emma's books, a collection of fairy tales with beautiful illustrations. Mary traced the pictures with her finger, while Samuel read aloud in a halting but clear voice. "You can read," Silas observed, surprised. Samuel nodded proudly. "Mama taught us. She says reading is the key to freedom." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." The words slipped out before Silas could stop them, revealing more warmth than he'd intended. Mary looked up from the book. "She is wise and kind. She helps everyone, even when they can't help her back." Her voice carried a certainty that made Silas envious. When had he last felt such unwavering faith in another person's goodness? He distributed the blankets with awkward efficiency, unused to caring for anyone's comfort but his own. The children accepted his efforts with quiet gratitude, but he could sense their wariness. They were polite but careful, speaking only when spoken to and moving with the cautious precision of people who had learned that safety could disappear without warning. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish for the question. They were warm and dry for the first time in days. Of course they were comfortable. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir," they replied in unison, their voices carrying the formal distance of children who had learned not to expect too much from adults. Silas retreated to the kitchen, where he attempted to organize breakfast for the morning. Sarah's recipe book lay on the shelf where she'd left it 5 years ago, its pages filled with her careful handwriting and gentle wisdom. He pulled it down and flipped through recipes for Johnny cakes and biscuits, trying to remember how to feed children properly. Sarah had always handled the domestic details while he focused on business. She had known instinctively what Emma needed. When she was hungry, when she was tired, when she needed comfort or correction. Silas had been a loving father, but a distant one, content to leave the daily nurturing to his wife's capable hands. Now faced with 2 children who depended on him for survival, he felt helplessly out of his depth. The recipe book offered guidance for making food, but nothing about healing traumatized hearts or building trust with children who had every reason to fear adults who looked like him. Through the thin walls, he could hear Samuel and Mary whispering to each other in voices too low to understand. They were probably frightened, sleeping in a stranger's house with no guarantee that their mother was still alive. The realization that they trusted him enough to close their eyes in his presence struck him as both humbling and terrifying. Sleep proved elusive. Silas lay in his own bed, listening to the storm rage outside and the unfamiliar sounds of children in his house. Every creak of the floorboards, every whispered word from the next room reminded him of Emma's presence in these same halls. The memories came whether he wanted them or not. Emma's laughter echoing in the morning, her small feet pattering across the wooden floors, her voice calling for him when nightmares frightened her awake. But these weren't his memories alone. The house itself seemed to be awakening, remembering its purpose as a home rather than a mausoleum. For 5 years, these rooms had held only silence and regret. Now they contained the possibility of life again, and the contrast was almost overwhelming. Morning came grey and cold, with snow still falling steadily beyond the frost-covered windows. Silas rose early and attempted to follow one of Sarah's simpler recipes, mixing flour and milk with uncertain hands. The results were serviceable, but far from the light, fluffy biscuits his wife had produced effortlessly. The children appeared in the kitchen doorway like cautious deer, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. They had made their bed carefully and folded the blankets with military precision, leaving Emma's room exactly as they'd found it. "Good morning," Silas said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Good morning, sir," they replied, maintaining their formal distance. "Are you hungry?" They nodded, but waited for permission before approaching the table. Silas served them his imperfect biscuits along with preserved fruit and fresh milk, watching as they ate with the same careful politeness they'd shown the night before. "The storm's still bad," Samuel observed, glancing toward the windows. "Roads will be blocked for days." "Yes," Silas agreed. "You'll need to stay here until it passes." "We're grateful, sir," Mary said quietly. "We know this isn't easy for you." The correction in her grammar struck him as both endearing and heartbreaking. Even at 8 years old, she was conscious of making a good impression, of speaking properly to earn acceptance. It reminded him uncomfortably of his own childhood efforts to please adults who held his fate in their hands. "Tell me about a mother," he said, surprising himself with the request. Samuel's face brightened. "She's the smartest person I know. She can read anything, newspapers, contracts, even legal papers. People come to her when they need help understanding things." "She taught herself," Mary added with obvious pride, "used to practice reading by lamplight after her work was done. She always says education is the one thing nobody can take away from you." Their obvious love for Ruth Washington created an unexpected ache in Silas's chest. These children had something he'd lost: absolute faith in someone's goodness, unshakable trust in love's permanence. Their mother had clearly given them more than food and shelter. She'd given them hope. "She sounds remarkable," he said, meaning it. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, reminding them all that the world beyond these walls remained hostile and uncertain. But inside the warm kitchen, with Sarah's recipe book open between them and the smell of imperfect biscuits filling the air, something fragile and precious was beginning to take root. By the second day, the snow had drifted so high against the windows that the house felt buried alive. Silas stood at the front door, measuring the white wall that now reached past his waist. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and he realized with growing unease that his young guests might be staying considerably longer than any of them had anticipated. "We're snowed in proper," he announced to the children, who were sitting by, the fireplace sharing one of Emma's old books. Samuel looked up from the pages with a thoughtfulness that seemed beyond his years. "How long do you think it'll last?" "Hard to say. Could be days, could be a week." Silas tried to keep his voice neutral, but the prospect of extended isolation with 2 children filled him with anxiety he couldn't name. "Don't worry, sir," Samuel said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small object. "I can help." Silas moved closer to examine what the boy held, a piece of wood no bigger than his thumb, carved into the rough shape of a bird. The workmanship was crude, but showed genuine skill and patience. More surprising was the tool Samuel used to create it, a small knife with a worn wooden handle, clearly handmade but sharp and well-maintained. "Where did you get that?" Silas asked, his tone sharper than he'd intended. Samuel's hand tightened, protectively around the knife. "I made it. Mama helped me find the metal and shape the handle. She said every man should know how to work with his hands." "It's not a toy," Silas said, his voice carrying echoes of old fears about children and dangerous objects. "No, sir, it ain't." Samuel's grammar slipped in his earnestness. "It's a tool. I use it for carving, but also for cutting rope and cleaning. Fish and lots of other things. Mama taught me to be careful." Mary looked up from her book. "Samuel's real good with it. He made me a doll once, when mine got lost crossing a river." Silas studied the boy more carefully, seeing things he'd missed before. Samuel's hands were already callous, despite his youth, marked by work and responsibility. His posture suggested someone accustomed to carrying burdens, and his eyes held the alert watchfulness of a child who'd learned that survival often depended on noticing details others missed. "Show me what else you can do with it," Silas said, his curiosity overcoming his caution. Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile Silas had seen from either child. He moved to the fireplace and began examining the logs, selecting pieces of kindling with a practiced eye. Within minutes, he'd carved several thin shavings that caught fire immediately when Silas applied a match. "Fire needs to breathe," Samuel explained as he worked. "Too much wood smothers it. But these shavings give it something easy to grab onto." "Your mother taught you that too?" "Yes, sir. She said we might need to take care of ourselves sometimes, so we should learn everything we could." Samuel's knife moved with confidence, creating curls of wood that seemed to glow in the firelight. "She taught Mary things too. Mary's got the best eyes for reading weather and finding water." As if summoned by her brother's praise, Mary approached them with quiet confidence. "There's a storm coming after this one," she said matter-of-factly. "I can tell by how the wind sounds different when it hits the house." Silas frowned. "How can you possibly know that?" "The birds," Mary replied, pointing toward the window. "When they're really quiet like this, hiding deep in whatever shelter they can find, it means the weather's going to stay bad. But when the wind changes direction, like it did about an hour ago, it means there's more weather pushing in behind." "She's always right," Samuel added with obvious pride in his sister. "Mama says Mary's got a gift for understanding what nature's trying to tell us." Silas found himself studying these children with new respect. They weren't just victims seeking shelter. They were capable individuals who'd developed real skills despite their youth. The realization made him uncomfortable, forcing him to reconsider his assumptions about both children and survival. "You've had to grow up fast," he observed. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied without complaint. "But Mama makes sure we still get to be children too. She tells us stories and teaches us games and makes sure we know we're loved." The simple statement hit Silas harder than any accusation could have. These children had faced hardships he could barely imagine, yet they spoke of their mother with unwavering devotion. They'd learned independence without losing innocence, developed strength without becoming hard. "Tell me about your journey," he said, settling into a chair near the fire. "How did you end up at my door?" The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Samuel began to speak, his voice taking on the rhythm of a well-practiced story. "We were staying at the rail camp while Mama worked. She got a message that there was better work at a camp 20 miles north, work that paid enough to maybe get us our own place come spring." Samuel's hands continued carving as he talked, the repetitive motion seeming to help him organize his thoughts. "She left us with food for 3 days," Mary continued. "Said she'd be back before we ran out, but the storm came early, and she didn't return. We waited as long as we could," Samuel added, "but the food ran out and the camp boss said we couldn't stay without Mama there to vouch for us. He gave us an hour to pack and leave." Silas felt anger building in his chest, not at the children, but at the callousness of adults who would abandon 2 young people to a blizzard. "What kind of man throws children out in weather like this?" "A scared one," Mary said with surprising wisdom. "People get scared when they don't understand things, and they do mean things to make the scared feeling go away. Her observation stung because it was so accurate. Silas recognized the behavior she described. He'd exhibited it himself. Throughout his business career, using cruelty to mask uncertainty and fear. "So you followed the fence lines," he said, steering the conversation back to safer ground. "For 2 days," Samuel confirmed. "Mama always told us fences lead to people, and people got to help each other when the world gets dangerous." "Your mother was right," Silas said, surprising himself by meaning it. As the afternoon wore on, the children gradually relaxed in his presence. Samuel showed him several carved animals, each one more sophisticated than the last. Mary demonstrated her ability to predict weather changes by listening to subtle shifts in wind patterns. Both children asked questions about ranch life with genuine curiosity, and Silas found himself sharing details he hadn't spoken aloud in years. "How many cattle do you have?" Mary asked. "None now. I sold them off after—" He stopped himself before mentioning his family's death. "After I decided I didn't want to ranch anymore." "But you still live here," Samuel observed. "On a ranch with no cattle?" "Yes." Silas couldn't explain the contradiction even to himself. "Maybe," Mary said thoughtfully, "maybe you're just waiting for the right reason to start again." Outside, the wind shifted exactly as Mary had predicted, and new snow began to fall with renewed intensity. But inside the warm house, 3 people, who'd started as strangers, were beginning to discover the tentative comfort of shared company. On the 4th morning, Silas woke to silence. The howling wind that had become the soundtrack of their confinement had finally stilled, leaving behind a world muffled in pristine white. He pushed aside the curtains to find the storm had passed, revealing a landscape transformed into something beautiful and alien. Snow reached nearly to the first-floor windows, sculpted by the wind into drifts that sparkled like jewels in the morning sun. The familiar landmarks of his ranch, the barn, the corral, the equipment shed, had become abstract shapes beneath their white blanket. Even if the roads were passable, which they clearly weren't, it would be days before anyone could travel. "Safely! The storm's over," he announced to the children, who were already awake and sitting by the dying fire. Samuel rose and joined him at the window, letting out a low whistle of appreciation. "I never seen snow this deep. Look how it's piled up against the barn. Must be 10 feet high." "Will the animals be all right?" Mary asked, concern evident in her voice. The question surprised Silas. Most people, especially children, wouldn't think to worry about livestock they'd never seen. "They'll be fine. The barn's built to handle storms like this." "Mama always taught us to think about the animals first," Mary explained. "She said creatures that can't speak for themselves depend on people to remember them." Another piece of wisdom. From the mysterious Ruth Washington. Over the past few days, Silas had heard dozens of such observations, each one revealing a woman of remarkable depth and compassion. The children quoted their mother with the reverence most people reserved for scripture, and their faith in her goodness had remained unshaken despite her apparent abandonment. "Tell me more about your mother's work," Silas said, settling into his chair with his morning coffee. It had become their routine, sharing the dawn hours before the day's activities began, talking quietly while the world outside remained still. Samuel reached into his shirt and pulled out a brass pocket watch, its case worn smooth by handling, but still gleaming with care. This was hers. She got it from a railroad supervisor who she helped read a contract. He said it was the least he could do for someone who'd saved him from signing away his children's future. "She can read contracts?" Silas asked, impressed despite himself. "She can read anything," Mary said with obvious pride. "Legal papers, medical books, even newspapers from back east. People come from 3 different camps just to ask her advice." "Reading's just the start," Samuel continued, handling the watch with reverent care. "She helps folks understand what they're agreeing to when they sign papers. Lots of railroad workers can't read, and the bosses take advantage. Mama makes sure people know what they're getting into." Silas studied the timepiece as Samuel handed it to him. It was a quality piece, manufactured by a reputable company and engraved with the words, "For services rendered," on the back. Someone had valued Ruth Washington's help enough to part with what was likely their most precious possession. "How did she learn all this?" he asked. "Started when she was still enslaved," Mary replied matter-of-factly. "The master's wife taught her to read so she could help with household accounts. After freedom came, Mama kept learning, from books, from people, from anybody willing to share knowledge. She says education is like water," Samuel added. "The more you share it, the more there is for everybody." The analogy struck Silas as both elegant and subversive. In his experience, knowledge was power, and power was something you hoarded rather than distributed. Yet these children spoke of their mother's generosity as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "She must have made enemies," Silas observed. "People don't always appreciate having their advantages challenged." "Some folks don't like her," Samuel admitted. "They think she's getting above herself, trying to be something she ain't supposed to be." "Isn't supposed to be," Mary corrected gently. "Isn't supposed to be," Samuel repeated. "But Mama says, fear makes people cruel, and the best way to fight cruelty is with kindness." More wisdom from Ruth Washington. Silas found himself increasingly curious about this woman who had raised such remarkable children, while navigating a world designed to limit her possibilities. Everything the children said painted a picture of someone who had transformed hardship into strength, bitterness into compassion. "Would you like to help me check on the animals?" he asked impulsively. "The snow's deep, but we can probably reach the barn." Both children brightened at the suggestion. They'd been cooped up inside for days, and the prospect of useful work clearly appealed to them. Silas found himself smiling at their enthusiasm, a reaction that caught him off guard with its naturalness. They spent the morning digging a path to the barn, working together with surprising efficiency. Samuel proved adept at reading snow conditions, choosing routes that avoided hidden obstacles. Mary had an intuitive understanding of where drifts would be stable enough to walk on. Both children worked without complaint, taking breaks only when Silas insisted. "You've done this before," he observed as they reached the barn door. "Different kind of weather, same principles," Samuel replied. "Mama taught us that work goes easier when everybody contributes what they can." Inside the barn, Silas was relieved to find his few remaining animals healthy and comfortable. The children moved among the horses and milk cow with easy confidence, speaking softly to the animals and checking their water with practiced efficiency. "This one's favoring her left front foot," Mary observed, pointing to his oldest mare. Silas examined the horse's hoof and found a small stone wedged against the shoe. "Good eye. How did you notice that?" "Animals tell you things if you know how to listen," Mary replied. "Mama says they're honest in ways people sometimes aren't." As they worked together caring for the animals, Silas found his earlier assumptions about these children crumbling. They weren't helpless victims requiring charity. They were capable individuals with skills he'd never thought to develop. Their mother had clearly prepared them for a world that would offer few advantages, teaching them to find strength in cooperation and hope in knowledge. "Your mother did well raising you," he said as they finished their work. "She's still raising us," Samuel replied with quiet determination. "She's coming back." The faith in the boy's voice was absolute, untainted by doubt or despair. Silas envied that certainty, even as it worried him. What would happen to these children if their mother never returned? What would happen to him if they had to leave? The thought surprised him with its intensity. Somewhere in the past few days, Samuel and Mary had stopped being strangers seeking shelter and had become something more precious, people he cared about. The realization terrified him. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant the possibility of loss. But as they walked back through the snow toward the warm house, sharing stories and laughter, Silas realized it was already too late for caution. These children had worked their way past his defenses with their courage, their kindness, and their unshakable faith in human goodness. For the first time in 5 years, his house felt like a home again. The decision came without conscious thought. Silas found himself standing outside Emma's room with the key in his hand, watching Mary struggle to repair a tear in her dress with clumsy stitches. The sight of the 8-year-old girl trying to mend her only good clothing with obvious inexperience stirred something protective in his chest. "Come with me," he said quietly. Mary looked up from her needlework, uncertainty flickering across her face. Samuel, who had been reading by the window, closed his book and followed as Silas led them down the hallway to a door that had remained locked for 5 years. The key turned with difficulty, metal protesting against disuse. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing a room frozen in time. Afternoon sunlight streamed through clean windows. Silas had maintained them even when he couldn't bear to enter, illuminating a space that still held the essence of childhood. Joy. Emma's porcelain doll sat propped against the pillows of her small bed, its painted blue eyes and golden ringlets as perfect as the day Sarah had brought it home from town. The doll wore a dress of pale green silk with tiny pearl buttons, more elaborate than anything a frontier child would normally possess, but befitting the daughter of a man who could afford such luxuries. "She's beautiful," Mary whispered, drawn to the doll, with the magnetic pull that such treasures exerted on little girls. "Her name was Evangeline," Silas said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "Emma named her after an angel in one of her storybooks." Mary approached the bed with reverent care, her fingers hovering just above the doll's dress without quite touching. "She looks like she's waiting for someone to come play with her." The observation cut deeper than any accusation could have. Evangeline had indeed been waiting. For 5 years, she'd sat in this room while dust gathered on her silk dress and silence replaced the laughter that had once filled these walls. "You can hold her," Silas said, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. Mary's eyes widened with wonder and disbelief. "Really? I can touch her? She's just a doll. She was made to be loved." With infinite care, Mary lifted Evangeline from her resting place. The doll's dress rustled softly, the sound triggering a flood of memories that hit Silas like a physical blow. Emma's voice echoing through this same room, her laughter as she created elaborate tea parties and adventures. The conversation she'd had with Evangeline, treating the doll like a beloved sister and confidant. Samuel remained in the doorway, sensing the weight of the moment. "This was your daughter's room," he said softly, not a question but an acknowledgement. "Yes." Silas moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape to avoid seeing Mary cradle Evangeline with the same tenderness Emma had shown. "She died when she was 7, same age as Mary is now." "What was she like?" Mary asked, her voice gentle with the intuitive compassion that seemed to come naturally to these children. "She was—" Silas stopped, realizing he hadn't spoken about Emma to another soul since her death. "She was sunlight, everything good and bright and hopeful about the world. She could make anyone smile, even on the darkest days." "Like Mary does," Samuel observed with loyalty that made Silas's throat tighten. "Yes, like Mary does." Mary settled into the small rocking chair beside Emma's bed, holding Evangeline with practiced care. "What happened to her?" "Influenza. It came through the territory in the spring of 1882, took dozens of people before it burned itself out." Silas's hands clenched into fists as the memories returned with unwanted clarity. "Emma got sick first. Sarah refused to leave her bedside, wouldn't eat or sleep properly. When Emma died, Sarah just gave up. She followed 3 days later." The children absorbed this information in solemn silence. Finally, Samuel spoke. "My papa died of a fever too. I was 5. I remember Mama crying for days, but then she said we had to be strong for each other. Your Mama was wiser than I was," Silas admitted. "When I lost them, I stopped caring about anything. Stopped trying to be good. It was easier to be cruel than to feel the pain." Mary looked up from the doll, her dark eyes bright with understanding that seemed far beyond her years. "Hurt makes people do terrible things sometimes, but it doesn't have to stay that way." "No," Silas agreed, surprised by the admission. "It doesn't." Over the following days, a subtle shift occurred in their daily routine. Mary spent hours in Emma's room, not playing exactly, but creating a gentle presence that seemed to breathe life back into the space. She would sit with Evangeline and read aloud from Emma's books, her voice carrying the same musical quality that had once made these walls ring with joy. Samuel, meanwhile, proved himself invaluable around the ranch. Despite his youth, he had an intuitive understanding of how things worked and an eagerness to learn that reminded Silas of his own boyhood enthusiasm. Together, they repaired winter damage to the barn, maintained the animals, and planned improvements. For spring, "You've got good hands," Silas told the boy as they worked on a stubborn gate latch. "Your mother taught you well." "She says work done right the first time saves trouble later," Samuel replied, his attention focused on the task. "And she says there's dignity in any job done with care." She's right about that too. More wisdom from the elusive Ruth Washington. The more Silas learned about her, the more he respected her philosophy and mourned her absence. These children were living proof of her character. Resilient without being hard, hopeful without being naive, capable without being proud. As they worked together through the long winter days, Silas began to remember what it felt like to have purpose beyond mere survival. Teaching Samuel how to properly care for leather tack, watching Mary bring gentle life back to Emma's room, these activities awakened parts of himself he'd thought permanently buried. But with renewed feeling came renewed vulnerability. Every evening, as the children settled in for the night, Silas found himself listening for sounds of distress, checking their room to ensure they were comfortable and safe. The protectiveness he felt for them was both wonderful and terrifying, a reminder of how much he'd lost and how much he now had to lose again. One evening, as Mary sat in Emma's room reading to Evangeline, she looked up at Silas with sudden intensity. "Do you think she would have liked us? Your Emma?" The question caught him unprepared, striking at emotions he was still learning to handle. "Yes," he said after a long moment, "I think she would have loved you both very much." Mary smiled, an expression of such pure joy that it transformed her face entirely. "I think I would have liked her too. She had good taste in dolls." That night, for the first time since Emma's death, Silas dreamed of his daughter without pain. In the dream, she was playing with Mary and Samuel in a sunlit meadow, their laughter creating music that made the whole world bright. When he woke, the grief was still there, but it had transformed into something gentler, not the sharp blade of loss, but the soft ache of love remembered. The sound of horses approaching through the snow reached Silas before he saw them. He was in the barn with Samuel, teaching the boy how to properly oil leather harnesses, when the rhythmic crunch of hooves broke the morning stillness. Both of them froze at the sound. After nearly a week of perfect isolation, the outside world was finally intruding on their fragile sanctuary. "Stay here," Silas instructed quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made Samuel's eyes widen with concern. Through the barn door, Silas watched 3 riders emerge from the tree line, their horses laboring through snow that reached nearly to their bellies. The lead rider wore a star-shaped badge that caught the morning light, Sheriff Tom Bradley, a man Silas knew by reputation, if not by friendship. The other 2 riders looked like deputies, though their bearing suggested they might be railroad security rather than local law enforcement. Silas stepped out of the barn as the riders approached his house, making sure they saw him before they could reach the door. The last thing he wanted was for Mary to answer their knock with her trusting innocence. "Sheriff Bradley," he called out, his voice carrying across the snow-muffled yard. "Wasn't expecting visitors in weather like this." Bradley reined in his horse and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that held more formality than warmth. "Mr. Monroe, sorry to disturb you, but we're on official business, looking for 2 Negro children, runaways who've been causing trouble along the rail line." The words hit Silas like a physical blow, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. "Children? In this weather?" "Yes, sir. A boy and girl. traveling alone. Their mother was caught stealing from the railroad company jewelry and cash from passenger cars. When we went to arrest her, she and the children disappeared into the storm. Silas's mind raced, processing this information against everything he'd learned about Ruth Washington from her children. The accusation didn't match the woman they'd described. Someone who helped others, who valued education and honesty above all else. "That's a serious charge," he said carefully. "Indeed it is," one of the other riders spoke up, his voice carrying the clipped accent of someone educated back east. "I'm Detective Morrison from the Railroad Security Division. We've been tracking these fugitives for the better part of a week." "The children are dangerous?" Silas asked, injecting just enough skepticism into his voice to sound like a concerned citizen rather than someone hiding something. "Children of thieves often follow in their parents' footsteps," Morrison replied coldly. "We have reason to believe they were accomplices in their mother's crimes." The assertion was so absurd that Silas nearly laughed. Samuel and Mary, with their careful politeness and desperate gratitude, accomplices to theft? The idea was ludicrous to anyone who'd spent 5 minutes in their company. "I haven't seen any children," Silas said, the lie coming easier than he'd expected. "Been snowed in for days. Haven't seen anyone." Sheriff Bradley studied him with tired eyes. "Mind if we take a look around? Just to be thorough." The request was phrased politely, but Silas recognized the underlying command. Refusing would only increase suspicion and probably result in a more thorough search later. His best hope was to give them a quick look around the public areas of the house while keeping them away from Emma's room, where Mary was probably playing with Evangeline. "Of course," he said, "though I warn you, I haven't been the best housekeeper since my wife died." He led them toward the house, hoping desperately that Samuel would have the sense to stay hidden in the barn. The snow crunched under their boots as they crossed the yard, the sound unnaturally loud in the winter stillness. Inside, Silas guided them through the kitchen and parlor, maintaining a steady stream of conversation about the storm's severity and his isolated lifestyle. The deputies poked around with professional thoroughness, but found no evidence of recent visitors. "Awful quiet out here," Bradley observed. "Must get lonely." "I prefer it that way," Silas replied truthfully. "People and I don't get along as well as we used to." As they prepared to leave, Morrison paused in the doorway, his pale eyes scanning the room one final time. "These children we're looking for, they're clever, been staying ahead of us for days. If they do show up here, Mr. Monroe, I hope you'll remember your civic duty." "Of course," Silas said, meeting the man's gaze without flinching. "Though I doubt anyone could survive long in this weather without proper shelter." "Let's hope not," Morrison replied with a smile that held no warmth. "For everyone's sake." After the riders disappeared back into the trees, Silas remained standing in his doorway for several minutes, his heart pounding with delayed reaction. The casual cruelty in Morrison's voice when speaking about children's survival had revealed more about the true nature of this pursuit than any official explanation could have. "Are they gone?" Samuel's voice came from behind him, barely above a whisper. Silas turned to find both children standing in the hallway, their faces pale with fear. Mary clutched Evangeline against her chest like a talisman, while Samuel's hand rested on the small knife at his belt. "Yes, they're gone," Silas said softly, "but they'll be back." "You didn't tell them about us," Mary said, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "No, I didn't." Silas closed the door and turned to face them fully. "But I need to know the truth. Did your mother steal from the railroad?" Samuel's jaw tightened with indignation. "Mama never stole nothing from nobody. She wouldn't take a penny. That wasn't hers fair and square. Then why are they hunting her? Why are they hunting you?" Mary and Samuel exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Mary spoke, her voice small but steady. "Mama found out about the contracts. The railroad was cheating workers, paying them in company scrip instead of real money, charging them more for food and shelter than they earned. She helped people understand what was happening. She started writing letters to newspapers back east," Samuel continued. telling them about how workers were being treated. The railroad bosses got angry, said she was stirring up trouble, so they accused her of theft to discredit her, Silas concluded, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Were supposed to meet her at the North Camp, Mary said. But when we got there, other workers told us the railroad men had been asking questions about Mama, saying she was a thief and that anyone who helped her would be in trouble. 2. That's when we started running, Samuel added. We've been hiding for days before the storm drove us to your door. Silas felt a familiar anger building in his chest, but this time it wasn't directed inward. The casual racism and corporate cruelty that had destroyed Ruth Washington's reputation and scattered her family was the same kind of systematic abuse he'd once participated in. The realization that he'd spent years becoming the very type of person now hunting these children filled him with self-loathing. What happens now? Mary asked quietly. Now. Silas looked at these two remarkable children who had somehow found their way to his door and into his heart. Now we make sure they don't take you, but they'll come back, Samuel protested. And when they do, they'll search harder. You could get in trouble for helping us. I've been in trouble before, Silas replied with grim determination. The difference is, this time I'll be in trouble for doing something right. Mary stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around his waist, pressing her face against his shirt. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for choosing us. The simple gratitude in her voice nearly broke his composure. When had anyone last thanked him for an act of kindness? When had he last deserved such thanks? We should leave, Samuel said reluctantly. We don't want to bring more trouble to your door. You're not going anywhere, Silas said firmly. This is your home now, at least until we can find your mother and clear her name. But how? Samuel began. I don't know yet, Silas admitted. But I know people, I have resources, and for the first time in 5 years, I have a reason to use them for something good. Outside, the wind began to pick up again, rattling windows and promising more snow. But inside the warm house, 3 people who had found each other in the storm were beginning to plan for a battle that would determine not just their future, but their souls. Silas spent the night pacing his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his former life. Law books lined the shelves, remnants of the legal education he'd used to manipulate contracts and exploit loopholes during his years as a land baron. Maps covered one wall, marked with properties he'd acquired through methods that still made his conscience ache. In the corner sat his old desk, its drawers filled with documents that represented both his greatest successes and his deepest shames. But tonight, these tools of his former cruelty might serve a higher purpose. By dawn, he had formulated a plan that was both audacious and dangerous. If the railroad wanted to play legal games, he would beat them at their own rules. But success would require reaching out to people he'd burned, calling in favors from men who had every reason to hate him. He began with Judge Harrison Blackwood, a territorial magistrate who owed his position partly to Silas's political influence during the land boom years. Their relationship had soured when Silas had forced through a particularly brutal foreclosure that cost Blackwood's own brother his farm, but the man still maintained a grudging respect for Silas's legal acumen. The telegraph office in Cedar Falls was 7 miles through treacherous snow, but Silas made the journey on horseback, leaving the children with strict instructions to stay hidden. The operator, a nervous man named Phillips, nearly dropped his key when Silas walked through the door. "Mr. Monroe, haven't seen you in town for months. I need to send some messages," Silas said, placing silver coins on the counter. "Private messages. I trust you understand the importance of discretion." Phillips nodded eagerly, his eyes fixed on the generous payment. "Of course, sir. Complete confidentiality." Silas spent an hour crafting carefully worded telegrams to contacts across 3 territories. To Judge Blackwood, he sent a request for legal consultation on adoption procedures for children of deceased parents. To Marcus Stern, a lawyer in Helena who specialized in railroad law, He requested information about labor disputes and false accusations in corporate employment. To Senator William Hayes, whose political career Silas had once helped launch, he sent a terse message about investigating corruption in territorial law enforcement. Each message was a carefully calculated risk. These men had no reason to help him and every reason to be suspicious of his motives. But they were also pragmatists who understood the value of maintaining useful connections, even with fallen former allies. The return journey to the ranch took twice as long, his horse struggling through drifts that had deepened during the morning. By the time he reached home, his legs were numb with cold and his face burned from windburn. But inside the warm house, Samuel and Mary waited with hot coffee and worried expressions that reminded him how much now depended on his success. "Where did you go?" Mary asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "To town, to start fighting back." Silas settled into his chair and accepted the coffee gratefully. "They want to use the law against you, so we'll use it against them. But we're just children," Samuel protested. "Who's going to believe us against grown men with badges?" "That's where I come in," Silas replied. "I may not be popular, but I still have connections. People who owe me favors, people who need my silence about certain business dealings. It's time to collect on some old debts." Over the following days, responses began arriving via telegram and occasional brave messenger. Judge Blackwood agreed to meet, though his message carried undertones of suspicion and wariness. Marcus Stern sent detailed information about recent railroad labor disputes, including several cases where companies had fabricated theft charges to silence troublesome workers. Senator Hayes promised to investigate, but warned that federal oversight of territorial law enforcement was limited. Most importantly, Silas received an unexpected ally in the form of Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, no relation to the railroad detective, a physician who had treated workers in various rail camps and had documented patterns of abuse and exploitation. Her detailed records, sent via trusted courier, provided exactly the kind of evidence Silas needed to build a case. "People have been watching," Dr. Morrison wrote in her accompanying letter. "The railroad's tactics are well known among those who work with the camps. Ruth Washington was not the first person they've tried to silence, and she won't be the last unless someone with sufficient resources decides to fight back." As Silas spread these documents across his desk, planning his strategy, he became aware of Samuel and Mary standing quietly in the doorway. They had been watching him work for several minutes, their faces filled with awe and something that looked like hope. "You're really going to fight for us," Mary said softly. "Not a question, but a statement of wonder." "I'm going to fight for what's right," Silas replied. "Your mother deserves justice, and you deserve to grow up free from fear." "But why?" Samuel asked. "You barely know us. This could bring you trouble with powerful people." Silas looked up from the papers, meeting the boy's earnest gaze. "Because 5 years ago, I lost my family and decided the world was too cruel to care about. I spent those years proving myself right, becoming exactly the kind of man who would destroy families for profit. But you two showed me something I'd forgotten." "What's that?" Mary asked. "That choosing to care, even when it's dangerous, is what makes us human. Your mother understood that. She risked everything to help others, and now it's my turn to risk everything to help her." That afternoon, while the children played quietly, in Emma's room, Silas began the delicate work of preparing adoption papers. His legal training served him well as he crafted documents that would appear legitimate to casual inspection while creating a paper trail that would be difficult to challenge. He backdated the papers to before Ruth Washington's disappearance, creating the fiction that she had legally transferred custody to him in case of emergency. The work required not just legal skill, but also artistic ability, as he carefully forged signatures and created the worn appearance of documents that had supposedly been stored in county offices for weeks. Each stroke of the pen felt like a small act of rebellion against the system he'd once used to destroy lives. "What you're doing," came Samuel's voice from the doorway. "It's illegal, isn't it?" Silas looked up to find both children watching him work, their expressions serious but not accusatory. "Yes," he admitted. "If they caught me forging legal documents, I could go to prison." "Then why?" Mary began. "Because sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing," Silas interrupted gently. "Sometimes good people have to break bad laws to protect what matters." Samuel stepped closer to the desk, studying the careful work Silas was doing. "Mama always said there's a difference between being legal and being right. Your mother was a wise woman. I'm beginning to understand just how wise." As he worked, Silas found himself thinking about the irony of his situation. For years, he'd used his legal knowledge to exploit technicalities and bend rules for personal gain. Now, for the first time, he was using those same skills to protect the innocent rather than prey upon them. The documents he was creating represented not just a legal shield for Samuel and Mary, but a kind of redemption for his own corrupted past. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his work just as he was applying the final forged seal. Through the window he could see the same 3 riders from before, but this time they were accompanied by 2 additional men who looked like federal marshals. "They're back," he said quietly, gathering the documents with steady hands. "With reinforcements." Samuel and Mary moved to the window, their faces pale but determined. "What do we do?" Samuel asked. "We trust in the law," Silas replied, slipping the adoption papers into his coat pocket. "The real law, not their version of it." "Will it work?" Mary asked, her voice small but brave. "I don't know," Silas admitted, "but I know we're going to try, and I know that whatever happens, we're going to face it together." He moved to his gun cabinet and removed his father's rifle, checking to ensure it was loaded. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, not just with physical weight, but with the moral implications of what he might be forced to do. For 5 years, he'd avoided violence, channeling his anger inward rather than outward. But if these men threatened Samuel and Mary, he would defend them with everything he had. "I want you both to stay in Emma's room," he instructed. "No matter what you hear, don't come out until I call for you." "We should run," Samuel said desperately. "We've brought too much trouble to your door." "No." Silas's voice carried absolute conviction. "No more running. This ends here, one way or another." Mary stepped forward and hugged him tightly around the waist, her small arms barely reaching around his frame. "I love you," she whispered against his shirt. The words hit him like a physical blow, carrying with them the weight of trust and hope and absolute faith. When had anyone last said those words to him? When had he last deserved to hear them? "I love you too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you. And I promise you this. Whatever happens out there, you will not be taken from this house against your will." As the riders drew closer, Silas checked the adoption papers one final time, then slipped them into his inner pocket. His hands were steady, his mind clear. For the first time in 5 years, he knew exactly who he was supposed to be. Silas stepped onto his porch with his father's rifle cradled in his arms, the weapon's worn wooden stock smooth against his palms. The 5 riders had arranged themselves in a semicircle around his house, their horses stamping nervously in the deep snow. Sheriff Bradley sat his mount with visible reluctance, while Detective Morrison displayed the cold confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. "Afternoon, Mr. Monroe," Bradley called out, his voice carrying forced civility. "I'm afraid we need to search your property more thoroughly this time. We have credible reports that you're harboring fugitives." "Credible reports from whom?" Silas asked, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Morrison urged his horse forward a few steps. "That's not your concern, old man. We have federal warrants now. Step aside." Silas raised the rifle slightly, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making his intentions clear. "This is my property, and I'll see those warrants before you set foot." Inside my house, one of the federal marshals, a thick-set man with graying whiskers, leaned forward in his saddle. "You're interfering with federal officers in the pursuit of their duties. That's a serious crime." "What's serious is falsely accusing children of crimes they didn't commit," Silas replied. "But since you mention the law, I have something you might find interesting." He reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, watching as several of the men tensed. Instead of a weapon, he withdrew the carefully prepared adoption papers, holding them high enough for all to see. "Legal documents," he announced, "properly filed and witnessed. Samuel and Mary Washington are now under my legal guardianship, transferred to my care by their mother in case of emergency." Morrison's face darkened with suspicion. Convenient timing for such documents to surface. The timing was prescient, not convenient, Silas replied smoothly. Ruth Washington was a careful mother who anticipated that her work might make her enemies. She ensured her children would be protected. Sheriff Bradley dismounted and approached the porch with obvious reluctance. "May I examine those papers?" Silas handed them over, watching as Bradley studied the forged documents with professional attention. The sheriff's expression revealed nothing, but Silas caught the subtle widening of his eyes as he took in the official seals and carefully crafted legal language. "These appear to be in order," Bradley said finally, his voice carrying a note of relief. "They're forgeries," Morrison snarled, dismounting with violent purpose. "This man is harboring criminals, and I won't be fooled by false papers." "By what authority do you question the validity of territorial court documents?" Silas asked, his voice taking on the sharp edge he'd once used to intimidate business rivals. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, and Silas's rifle came up in response. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the snow-covered yard, the tension thick enough to taste. "Easy now," Bradley said, stepping between them with raised hands. "Let's all calm down and think about this rationally." The sound of approaching riders interrupted the standoff. Silas glanced past the federal officers to see a group of townspeople emerging from the tree line, led by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison. On her sturdy mare, behind her rode Henrik Anderson, the Norwegian farmer Silas had once displaced, along with several other men whose faces Silas recognized from his darker past. "What's this about, Sheriff?" Dr. Morrison called out as she approached. "We heard there was trouble at the Monroe place." Detective Morrison whirled to face her, his face flushed with anger. "This doesn't concern you, woman. Return to your medical practice and leave law enforcement to men." Dr. Morrison's expression hardened. "It concerns me when federal officers harass families under my medical care. Samuel and Mary Washington are my patients, and I have documentation of their mother's character that contradicts your accusations." "Documentation?" Sheriff Bradley asked with interest. "Detailed records of Ruth Washington's work with railroad families, including testimony from dozens of workers who can attest to her honesty and integrity." Dr. Morrison produced a leather satchel from her saddlebag. "I've been investigating the railroad's treatment of workers for months. Your Mrs. Washington was trying to expose systematic fraud, not committing theft." Henrik Anderson rode forward, his weathered face grim with determination. "I can vouch for Monroe's character too, though it pains me to say it. He may have wronged me years ago, but he's not the kind of man to harbor criminals. If he says these children are innocent, I believe him." The simple statement carried weight that surprised everyone present. Henrik's forgiveness, offered publicly despite past wrongs, created a moment of moral clarity that made Detective Morrison's aggressive stance appear increasingly unreasonable. "This is absurd," Morrison protested. "You're all being manipulated by a known criminal sympathizer." "Who exactly is the criminal here?" Dr. Morrison asked pointedly. "The woman trying to protect workers from exploitation, or the company manufacturing evidence to silence her?" Samuel and Mary appeared suddenly, in the doorway behind Silas, their young faces set with determination that made his heart swell with pride. "We're not running anymore," Samuel announced, his voice carrying across the yard with startling authority. "Our mama didn't steal nothing, and we're not criminals. We trust Mr. Monroe to protect us," Mary added, moving to stand beside Silas. With absolute faith, the sight of these brave children choosing to face their accusers rather than hide struck several of the townspeople visibly. Even some of the federal officers shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, perhaps reconsidering the wisdom of their mission. Dr. Morrison opened her leather satchel and withdrew a thick bundle of papers, the pages crackling in the cold air as she held them aloft. "I have here written testimony from 43 railroad workers, all willing to swear under oath to Ruth Washington's character and the railroad's systematic theft of wages." Detective Morrison's face went pale. "Those statements are inadmissible. Railroad workers are unreliable witnesses." "Unreliable because they're mostly immigrants and former slaves?" Dr. Morrison asked with steel in her voice. "Or unreliable because they threaten your company's profits?" Sheriff Bradley stepped forward and accepted the documents from Dr. Morrison, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he read. "These are serious allegations: wage theft, contract fraud, deliberate exploitation of workers who can't read English." "All lies," Detective Morrison insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Henrik Anderson dismounted and approached the sheriff. "May I see those papers? I can't read English well, but I know what it looks like when powerful men cheat working." "Folks!" As Bradley handed over the documents, more riders appeared through the trees. Silas recognized several faces from town: shopkeepers, farmers, even the Methodist minister. Word had apparently spread through Cedar Falls that federal officers were threatening the Monroe Ranch, and the community had come to see what was happening. Among the newcomers was Marcus Stern, the lawyer from Helena, whose telegram had provided crucial information about railroad tactics. His presence transformed the situation from a local dispute into something with territorial significance. "Mr. Monroe," Stern called out as he approached, "I received your telegram and came as quickly. As the roads allowed, I see the situation has escalated." "Indeed it has," Silas replied. "Detective Morrison here claims to have federal authority to remove children from my legal custody based on fabricated charges against their mother." Stern studied the adoption papers with a professional eye, then examined Dr. Morrison's documentation. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the details. "Sheriff Bradley," Stern said formally, "I'm afraid you've been misled. The federal government has no jurisdiction over territorial adoption proceedings, and these railroad warrants appear to be based on perjured testimony." Detective Morrison's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the situation here. These people are stirring up trouble among the workers, spreading lies about legitimate business practices." "The only lies I see," Stern replied coldly, "are the false accusations used to justify persecuting a woman whose only crime was literacy." Samuel stepped forward from the porch, his young voice carrying clearly across the yard. "My mama taught me that telling the truth is always right, even when it's hard. She was trying to help people understand their contracts, trying to stop them from being cheated." "The boy speaks truly," called out a new voice from the edge of the crowd. An elderly black man rode forward on a tired horse, his clothes marking him as a railroad worker. "I'm Isaiah Jackson, been working the rails for 15 years. Ruth Washington saved my family from starvation when she showed us how the company was stealing our wages through false charges." More voices rose from the crowd as other workers stepped forward to support Isaiah's testimony. The momentum of the confrontation shifted dramatically as person after person vouched for Ruth Washington's integrity and detailed the railroad's systematic abuse of vulnerable workers. "This is getting out of hand," one of the federal marshals muttered to his partner. Detective Morrison drew his gun suddenly, his desperation making him dangerous. "I don't care what lies these people tell. I have my orders, and I'm taking those children." The crowd surged backward as weapons appeared on both sides. Silas raised his rifle while several townspeople drew their own guns. the situation balanced. On a knife's edge, violence seeming inevitable. Then Mary stepped forward, moving past Silas to stand at the edge of the porch. Her small voice somehow carried over the tension and noise of the confrontation. "Please don't fight over us," she said, her words ringing with surprising authority. "We're just children. We don't want anyone to get hurt because of us." Her simple plea shamed the adults present, reminding them that their conflict was supposed to be about protecting innocence, not destroying it through violence. Sheriff Bradley holstered his weapon and stepped between Morrison and the crowd. "Detective Morrison, I'm placing you under arrest for threatening minors and attempting to enforce fraudulent warrants." "You can't arrest a federal officer," Morrison protested. "I can arrest anyone who threatens children in my territory," Bradley replied firmly, "especially when those threats are based on perjured evidence and manufactured charges." The federal marshals looked at each other uncertainly, clearly reconsidering their involvement in what was rapidly becoming a scandal rather than a law enforcement action. Marcus Stern addressed the crowd with loyal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we've witnessed here today is an attempted kidnapping, disguised as law enforcement. I'll be filing formal complaints with both territorial and federal authorities about the railroad's abuse of legal process." As Detective Morrison was disarmed and restrained, the tension in the yard began to dissipate. Community members who had once shunned Silas Monroe now approached him with respect, their shared defense of the children creating new bonds that transcended old grievances. "Mr. Monroe," Henrik Anderson said quietly, "perhaps we could call our account settled now." Silas extended his hand to the man he'd once wronged. "It would be an honor, Henrik. Thank you for standing with us." As the two men shook hands, Mary and Samuel ran to embrace Silas, their relief and joy infectious enough to bring smiles even to the faces of hardened lawmen. Spring came to Montana Territory like a gentle promise kept, melting away the frozen barriers that had defined their winter together. By April, the snow had retreated to reveal a world transformed, not just by the changing season, but by the love that now filled the Monroe Ranch with laughter and purpose. The photograph arrived from the territorial capital along with the official adoption papers, both documents representing the legal culmination of what had already become reality in their hearts. Judge Blackwood had proven surprisingly cooperative once the railroad's corruption came to light, fast-tracking the adoption proceedings with an efficiency that spoke to both justice and political expediency. Silas held the photograph carefully, studying the formal portrait of himself, flanked by Samuel and Mary in their finest clothes. The photographer had posed them in front of a painted backdrop of mountains and trees, but no artificial scenery could match the genuine happiness visible in their faces. Samuel stood straight and proud in his new suit, while Mary beamed in a blue dress that brought out the warmth in her dark eyes. Silas himself looked different, older perhaps, but somehow more alive than he'd appeared in years. "Do we really look that happy?" Mary asked, peering over his shoulder at the image. "Happier," Silas replied, setting the photograph carefully on the mantelpiece beside the wooden cross that had once marked his family's grave, but now served as a reminder of how love could survive even death. The news about Ruth Washington had arrived 3 weeks earlier, carried by a telegraph operator who'd ridden hard through the spring mud to deliver the message. She was alive and safe in Calgary, having been sheltered by other railroad workers who'd helped her escape across the Canadian border. More importantly, she was free. The railroad's false charges had been dropped under pressure from federal investigators who'd discovered the company's systematic fraud. "Mama's letter should arrive soon," Samuel said, checking the brass pocket watch that had become his most treasured possession. "The mail coach is due any time now." The letter, when it finally came, contained words that made them all weep with joy and gratitude. Ruth Washington wrote with the eloquence that had made her so valuable to her fellow workers, expressing her love for her children and her profound appreciation for the man who had protected them. "I always taught Samuel and Mary that angels could take many forms," she had written. "I never imagined one would be a gruff old rancher with a wounded heart. You saved more than their lives, Mr. Monroe. You saved their faith in human goodness. I can never repay such a gift, but I pray that God will bless you with the family you've always deserved." The reunion had been planned for midsummer, when travel would be safest and Ruth could arrange proper transportation south. Until then, letters flew back and forth like migrating birds, carrying news and love across the miles that separated mother and children. "She says the Canadian government is very interested in her testimony about railroad practices," Mary reported, reading from their most recent letter. "They're thinking about changing laws to protect workers better. Your mother is still fighting for what's right," Silas observed with admiration. "Some people never lose that fire." As spring progressed into early summer, the Monroe Ranch transformed from a monument to grief into a celebration of life. Silas hired back some of his former workers, men who'd scattered after Sarah and Emma's death, but who returned with quiet respect for what he'd accomplished. The cattle herd grew as he reinvested in the business that had once been his passion. More importantly, the house filled with the sounds of family life. Samuel proved remarkably gifted with animals, developing an intuitive understanding of horses that impressed even experienced ranchers. Mary showed equal talent for the domestic arts, learning from Sarah's old recipe books while adding her own innovations that would have made her mother proud. The community's transformation was equally remarkable. Henrik Anderson became a regular visitor, often bringing his own grandchildren to play with Samuel and Mary. Dr. Morrison established a permanent medical practice in Cedar Falls, funded partly by donations from grateful railroad workers whose cases she'd helped resolve. Even Sheriff Bradley seemed changed by the events, approaching his duties with renewed dedication to actual justice rather than mere enforcement. "It's funny," Mary observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains. "Gold, how standing up to bad people makes everyone want to be better." "Your mother would be proud of that observation," Silas replied, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to flow naturally from these remarkable children. Samuel carved quietly beside them, his skilled hands creating a wooden bird that seemed ready to take flight. "Are you going to miss us when Mama comes back?" he asked without looking up from his work. The question caught Silas off guard, striking at fears he'd tried not to acknowledge. "Miss you? Samuel, you're not going anywhere. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. But Mama, your mother is welcome here too," Silas said firmly. "This ranch is big enough for all of us, and I suspect I could use her help managing you two troublemakers." Mary giggled at the affectionate insult, then grew serious. "Do you really mean it? We can all stay together, forever and always, Silas." Promised, the words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, Silas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a bitter recluse, consumed by grief and self-loathing. Now he was a father again, surrounded by love and purpose, his life given meaning by 2 children who'd appeared at his door like answers to prayers he'd never dared speak. Sometimes the coldest winter really could melt the hardest heart. Sometimes redemption really did come knocking when you least expected it. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, love proved stronger than fear, hope more enduring than hatred, and family more powerful than the forces that tried to tear it apart.